Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving into a topic today that's pretty intense, and that's the science of psychological trauma. Basically, we're going to break down what happens in our brains and bodies after something really awful happens.
And we're going to be taking a close look at the onset of trauma brief from the SCARS Institute for this deep dive.
And they would know, they're really the leaders when we're talking about the impact of things like scams, which can be obviously super traumatic for people.
Absolutely.
This is heavy stuff,
Yeah.
but it's so important to understand this, not just for ourselves, but for our friends and family and people that we know as well. I think one of the most fascinating things, and what the SCARS brief really does a good job of, I think, is breaking the whole thing down into stages.
Yeah.
It makes it a little bit easier to digest, I think.
Yeah, and they break it down into 4 key phases, which are shock, cognitive dissonance, and overload, shutdown, and then finally the onset of trauma itself.
Okay, so let's unpack that. I want to start right at that initial moment when everything kind of goes wrong and your brain goes, oh no, something is wrong.
Right.
Shock. That very first.
Imagine that your brain is just kind of like cruising along, it's processing the world, everything is normal, and then bam! Some kind of traumatic event throws everything off the rails.
Yeah.
That's where shock comes in. It's your brain going, whoa, 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 let's slam on the brakes here, and trying to protect you from being completely overwhelmed.
So almost like an instinct then. It's like a built-in alarm system, kind of.
Exactly. It's totally an instinct, and it's driven by a part of your brain called the amygdala. It's basically your own personal little alarm system. And as soon as that amygdala senses danger, it's going to flood your system with adrenaline, all those lovely stress hormones.
Oh, yeah.
Which is what kicks off that fight or flight response.
Right. And we've all felt that, right? That sudden jolt of energy when something stressful happens.
Yes, exactly. But sometimes when the stress is just too much, your brain is going to take it one step further and activate something called a dissociative state. Have you ever, experienced something incredibly stressful, and it's almost like you're watching yourself from outside of your body?
Oh, absolutely. Like after a car accident or something like that, it feels very surreal.
Exactly. And that's your brain trying to shield you from the full force of the experience. It's a way of coping in those initial moments of extreme stress.
Wow.
But here's where things get even more complicated. We go from shock into the next stage, which is cognitive dissonance and overload. Think of it this way. Our brains crave order, right?
All right.
So we build these mental models in our head of how the world works, and when something traumatic happens, it's like those models shatter.
It's like the rug is pulled out from under you.
Exactly.
And the SCARS brief actually gives a really good example of this when they talk about how scam victims, for example, often struggle with this.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like if you think of yourself as a cautious person and you fall victim to a scam, there's that real clash.
Yes.
That's dissonance, isn't it?
That's cognitive dissonance in action. Your brain is going, hold on a second, someone who is normally so careful, how could this have happened to me?
Right.
And as your brain is trying to process all of this unexpected information, that's where the overload comes in.
Okay.
It's like trying to cram way too much data onto a floppy disk. There's just not enough space. It's like your brain just hits this overload point and goes, nope, I'm out of here, shutting it all down.
Shut down. Sounds very peaceful, but I have a feeling it's anything but peaceful.
Yeah, not quite. It's more like hitting the pause button on all that processing.
Okay.
So it's that numbness, that feeling of being emotionally detached that a lot of people feel after something truly awful happens.
Right.
And it might seem like your brain is just kind of chilling out, taking a break, but there's a lot going on under the surface.
And this is where that vagus nerve we talked about earlier comes in,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
I've been wanting to circle back to that because it sounds like it's a pretty key player in this whole stress response system.
The vagus nerve is like the information superhighway between your brain and your internal organs.
Okay.
It's always listening in on what's happening up top. And when it senses danger, which in this case is your brain going haywire from trauma, it slams on the brakes and goes into freeze mode.
Oh, wow. So it's like fight, flight, or freeze.
Exactly. Think of like animals that play dead when they're faced with a predator.
Right.
That's their vagus nerve in action.
Wow.
And it happens to us, too. It's why some people freeze up completely during a traumatic event instead of fighting back or running away. That's really interesting. I never thought about it that way because you always kind of judge yourself or other people for not reacting in a certain way. But it's biological, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not a conscious choice. It's literally an ancient survival mechanism kicking in.
Wow. Fascinating.
But here's the thing about all of these initial stages, the shock, the dissonance, the shutdown. Trauma isn't just the actual event itself. It's what happens when our brain gets stuck in that processing loop. and can't move past those initial feelings of being overwhelmed.
Right.
And that brings us to that final stage,
Sure.
the onset of trauma.
So this is where it all comes together. It's not just the event. It's the fact that our brains get stuck in that loop of fear and confusion and all of that.
Right.
That's what actually defines the onset of the trauma itself. So what's going on in the brain at that point? So remember we were talking about the brain being like a computer? Well, imagine your hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that's in charge of memory storage. That's your brain's hard drive. Now, picture trauma as like a computer virus. It gets in there and just scrambles all the data.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So instead of your memories being stored in this nice, organized way, it's just chaos.
And they're all jumbled up.
Exactly. Fragmented, disorganized. It's almost impossible to access them in a coherent way. So you're not only dealing with the emotional impact of what you went through, your brain's ability to even remember it clearly is totally messed up.
That's terrifying. That's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half are warped.
Perfect analogy.
Oh, my goodness.
And if that wasn't bad enough, your prefrontal cortex, which is like the CEO of your brain, the part that's responsible for rational thought and decision-making,
Right.
it's drowning in a sea of stress hormones. It's like trying to have a calm conversation in the middle of a hurricane impossible.
So not only are your memories all messed up, but your ability to think clearly has gone out the window, too. No wonder people describe feeling so lost and broken after a traumatic experience. It's like their entire inner world has been, like, flipped on its head.
Exactly. And the really cruel part is that all this internal chaos can lead to a lot of self-blame.
Right.
The SCARS brief really emphasizes how common it is for people to experience guilt and shame after a traumatic event.
Yeah, which makes sense if you think about it, right?
Oh.
Because if your brain is stuck in that loop of fear and confusion, it's going to start looking for someone to blame.
Yeah.
And who's easier to blame than yourself?
Exactly, even if you know logically that none of it was your fault. And that's why understanding these underlying mechanisms is so important.
Right.
Because when you realize that those feelings of shame and guilt are often a direct result of how your brain processed the trauma, it can be incredibly validating and empowering.
It's like, okay, so my brain's not broken. It's actually just trying to protect me, even if it's not doing a great job of it in the long run.
Yeah.
But we've talked a lot about what happens during and right after a traumatic event. But what can people actually do about it? How do we deal with the aftermath? And the SCARS brief really emphasizes that trauma is treatable. It's not a life sentence, which is so important for people to hear, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that treatment actually look like? What can people do?
Well, I think the first and most important thing is to seek help from a qualified therapist, specifically someone who specializes in trauma.
Okay.
And there are very specific types of therapy that have been proven to be really effective, like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard CBT, but what makes the trauma-focused one different?
So regular CBT can be really helpful for identifying and changing those negative thought patterns that we all get stuck in, right? Trauma-focused CBT takes that a step further and really helps you address the thoughts and beliefs that are directly related to the traumatic event. Remember, we were talking earlier about that feeling of, this shouldn't have happened to me.
Right, right.
Trauma-focused CBT is really good at helping you process that cognitive dissonance and reframe those experiences in a healthier way.
So it's like rewiring those pathways, those neural pathways in your brain.
Exactly.
To help your brain kind of find a new normal after everything that's happened.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are even some things that you can start doing on your own right now, today, to start managing those overwhelming feelings. Things like grounding techniques and mindfulness exercises. Those can be incredibly powerful tools to have in your self-care toolkit.
Those sound great, actually. What do those look like?
Grounding techniques are all about bringing your attention to the present moment, using your 5 senses to really connect with your surroundings. It can be as simple as feeling your feet on the floor, noticing the colors and textures that you see around you, or even just focusing on your breath.
So it's like you're telling your nervous system, okay, we're safe right now, right here in this moment.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
And mindfulness is similar, but it's more about observing your thoughts and feelings without judgment. So instead of getting swept away by all those negative emotions, you learn to just acknowledge them, sit with them for a little bit, and let them pass.
Both of those sound like really, really helpful things to have in your back pocket, not just for dealing with trauma, but also, for everyday stress and anxiety as well.
Oh, for sure. And I think that's another really important point is that healing from trauma, it's not linear.
Right.
There are going to be ups and downs along the way. It's a journey. But with the right support and by developing these healthy coping skills, recovery and growth are absolutely possible.
That is so important for people to know because I think it can be so isolating to deal with the effects of trauma. And sometimes you just feel like you're the only one going through it. But that's so not true. There are things you can do to heal and move forward.
Well said.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to surface from this deep dive into psychological trauma. We've covered a lot today, from that initial shock to the long-lasting impact that it can have on us, our brains, our bodies. But I think there's one thing I want you to take away from this conversation. It's that knowledge is power.
I agree. Understanding how trauma actually works, that can be so empowering.
Yes. It allows you to cultivate self-compassion, find the right support for yourself, and most importantly, start on that path to healing.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I'm going to leave you with one final thought. We've talked a lot about what happens in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, but it doesn't end there. This journey, it doesn't end there. So think about how unresolved trauma might show up in your life down the road. How might it affect your relationships, how you see yourself, even your worldview? It's a lot to think about, but maybe it'll spark a deep dive of your own into this fascinating, complicated world of the human mind. Till next time.